house. A cold wind blew through the house, rattling the windows and slamming the doors. And just like that, it was gone. The temperature returned to normal. It would seem that the entity had left, and for the following 2 years, all was well. But eventually, the entity did return, and when it did, it returned with a vengeance. 2 years later, Philip had now left school and went to work in his father's pet shop. Diane was now a teenager, and Mrs. Scholes, the grandmother, was now 72 and spent the weekends with the Prichards. Mrs. Scholes had never forgotten the strange things that happened 2 years previously, and had recently started to bring it up in conversation. The family didn't appreciate Grandma bringing up these paranormal activity stories. They wanted to forget, but it was obviously bothering Mrs. Scholes. One afternoon, Jean had decided to decorate Diane's bedroom. After a while, she decided it was time for a drink and went downstairs to make a cup of tea for herself and her mother, who was once again talking about the entity. When Jean had finished her drink, she decided to head back upstairs and continue with the decorating, and I can imagine she was getting a little bit fed up of all the talk of ghosts and poltergeists. As Jean approached the bottom of the stairway, she noticed that Diane's counterpane off her bed had somehow made its way downstairs and was lying on the hallway floor. Now, Jean thought this was strange how Diane's bedsheet had left her bed and made its way to the bottom of the stairs, but Jean just shrugged it off and took it back upstairs to Diane's bedroom and proceeded to carry on with the decorating. It wasn't long before she heard a very large crash. She ran out to the landing and peered down the stairs. There was another counterpane bedsheet at the bottom of the stairs. This time, it was Philip's, and it was surrounded by many plant pots that had fallen and spilled soil all over the floor. It would seem that Mrs. Scholes was right. It had returned. Many speculate if it returned because Mrs. Scholes was constantly talking about it. Who knows, maybe it did. Maybe Mrs. Scholes gave it the attention it needed to return. Or maybe Mrs. Scholes simply started talking about it because it had returned and she could feel it. But one thing I can tell you is that Mrs. Scholes did not stay there that night. She went home. That night, as the Prichards all slept, Jean lay wide awake. It was a very warm night and it was making her restless, so she decided to get up. She hadn't yet finished decorating Diane's bedroom, and all the paint supplies she had removed earlier on that night out onto the landing. As Jean stepped out of her bedroom into the darkness of the landing with only the outside street lamp shining through the window, she noticed a chill in the air. And then she noticed something in the corner of her eye, and as she peered down the dark landing she could see an object floating in mid-air. It was accompanied by a rustling noise. As soon as Jean flicked on the landing light, a paintbrush went flying past her head, followed by a paste bucket, splashing paint all over the place. In shock, Jean stared towards the rustling noise, and it was a roll of wallpaper that had somehow been manipulated into the shape of a snake, as it swayed back and forth as if it was getting ready to strike. Jean made a grab at the paper, and whatever power was manipulating it dispersed, and it rolled out onto the floor. As soon as this happened, a carpet sweeper flew up into the air, spinning around in a crazy spiral. Jean dropped to her hands and knees and crawled back to her bedroom, a roll of wallpaper smashing against the door as she entered the room. Jean finally found her voice and screamed, waking Joe and the kids, who came running onto the landing to see what was going on. Paintbrushes once again started to fly through the air at an incredible speed and managed to strike Diane on the shoulder. But incredibly, she would later say despite the speed it was travelling, it didn't hurt her at all. All the activity on the landing abruptly stopped and restarted in Diane's bedroom. Philip had a clear view into the room and witnessed a wooden pelmet that was screwed in above Diane's window break away, tearing the screws from the wall, and then flew out of the window and fell outside the house. I'm assuming the window was left open that night due to how warm it was. Joe ran to Diane's door and slammed it shut, and as he did so, total chaos broke loose inside the room. From the other side of the door, it sounded as if every object in Diane's room was being thrown around in complete anger. For some reason, maybe a moment of madness, Diane decided to reach out for her doorknob and try to open the door. Her father shouted, "Don't touch it," and as though the entity was responding to Joe, it sent a tremendous thump to the bedroom door that shook the door frame. That night, the entire Prichard family slept in Joe and Jean's room with the door locked, but to be honest, it probably wouldn't have helped. Now, at this part of the story, I should probably say that up until this happening, Joe didn't actually believe in the poltergeists. Everyone else kind of bought Philip and Mrs. Scholes' story, but Joe was a bit of a skeptic, and he thought they were all just being a little bit silly, and he didn't really believe in the poltergeist. But if there was one thing that changed his mind, it was that night and another incident that happened to him. Apparently, one day Joe had ventured into the coal shed. Now, apparently when he was inside the shed, he got the sense that there was a horrible feeling, like a presence that joined him, and the door to the coal shed locked, and he was unable to get out, and he could feel this presence in there with him in the dark. It's unknown what actually happened in the shed with Joe. He never really spoke of it. However, this and the events that happened on that night did change his mind about the poltergeist from that point on. And it was from that day on that activity in the house started to pick up a lot. Don't get me wrong, there were days when nothing happened at all, but then there were days when it would just go crazy. And here's a good example. One day Jean had a friend over, and they were stood in the hallway chatting when they noticed something strange coming from the top of the landing. You see, at the top of the stairs stood an old grandfather clock, and they noticed that it had begun to sway ever so slightly back and forth, back and forth. And then, without warning, the grandfather clock comes smashing down the stairs, breaking into pieces when it hit the bottom. It would seem that the poltergeist was doing everything it could in its power to be noticed. And the poltergeist also gave off the impression that it was very much aware of its surroundings, and it was aware of the Prichards. At times, its attacks were random, and at other times it seemed like it was listening and responding to things the Prichards had actually said in conversation. Sometimes it seemed it was creating noise purely for attention, like a child. It craved it. Sometimes the knocks seemed to be made in desperation, and Colin Wilson's book did a good job at describing this. In the book, he said that it was like someone knocking on your front door, desperately wanted to come in. And then at other times it simply seemed mischievous, like a practical joker. And so you couldn't blame the Prichards for starting to feel like their unwanted guest did indeed have a personality all of its own. And although they were still very afraid of the entity, maybe this is one of the reasons they didn't up and leave. In fact, they even named the entity. They named it Mr. Nobody, and later they would rename it Fred. Now, as I mentioned earlier, poltergeist stories seem to revolve around teenagers who are going through puberty, like they feed off the teenagers' energy. If this is true, it would explain why Fred the poltergeist was noticeably quieter during the day when Diane, who was a teenager at the time, was at school. But when night fell, Fred would wake up and start to bang on the walls. He'd bang on the doors, he'd move furniture. He also had a reputation for turning off the house lights at the fuse box under the stairs. One particular night, as the lights went off once again for the umpteenth time, Jean decided to take some sticky tape and actually stick the switch down on the fuse box so that it couldn't be flicked once again. But within half an hour, the lights were off again. Jean went to the switch box to find that the tape, which was holding the switch in position, had simply vanished into thin air. After a while, the Prichards decided enough was enough, and a Reverend Davy was called to try and exorcise the entity known as Fred. After the church granted permission, Reverend Davy turned up at the house and waited for any sign of a haunting. The Reverend and the Pritchards sat in the living room for an hour and a half and nothing happened. And so the Reverend was probably getting a little bit frustrated and probably felt that his time was being wasted, and he got up to leave. He decided that there was nothing going on in this house, there was no ghost, there was no poltergeist, the Pritchards were just simply time wasters. Maybe they were just after their 5 minutes of fame. As he got up to leave, the house just seemed to come alive, and there were bangs and loud bumps and thumps coming from all around the house, and then a candlestick fell from the mantelpiece to the floor. The vicar was still not convinced. He suggested this was simply subsidence in the house, nothing more, nothing less. As if the entity was listening, another candlestick floated from the mantelpiece and made its way over to the vicar and just hung there in the air in front of his nose before dropping to the ground. It was at this point that Jean couldn't help but be a little amused, as she asked if he still believed it was simply subsidence. The vicar stood there trying to come to terms with what he had just seen, when all of a sudden there was an enormous crash that came from the other room. As they returned into the room to investigate, they discovered that every single plate and cup from Jean's china cupboard had been scattered all over the floor, and incredibly, not one was broken. The vicar composed himself, took a deep breath, and then offered the following advice: move house. But for some reason, Jean refused to be ran out of her own home. That night, as Diane was making her way upstairs, once again the lights went out and she stood in the hallway in complete darkness as Joel Prichard was looking for a torch. As Diane stood there in the hallway, she noticed a dark shadow form on the wall, and that familiar cold chill made the hairs on her arms stand up. In the hall was a big piece of oak furniture that floated into the air and pinned Diane between it and the stairs. As soon as the lights were on, Jean noticed what had happened, and she called for Joe to help. They both grabbed the oak stand and tried in vain to lift it off Diane, who was now panicking underneath. But here's the thing, it wasn't hurting her, it was just pinning her down, like some unseen force was pushing it down on her. Jean suggested Diane calm down and try to relax. I don't know how, but she managed it, and the entity, or Fred, released her. Jean took Diane to bed, and that is something I'll never understand. How do you simply sleep after something like that has just happened? I mean, maybe the activity was happening that often that they become kind of numb to it, like it was the norm. But still, I don't think I would sleep soundly that night. And funnily enough, Diane didn't. You see, that night Diane got into bed and Fred continuously flipped her out of bed and threw a mattress on top of her on the floor. This happened a total of 4 times. Eventually the press came round to write stories on the house. 30 East Drive was becoming a bit of an attraction. Would-be ghost hunters were knocking at the door to ask if they could come in and investigate. The Prichards would wake up in the morning to find that people had actually camped out all night in front of the house in hopes of hearing or seeing something. And miners on their way to work in the pits in the mornings would often report hearing Fred the poltergeist banging and knocking for their attention. And Fred was about to demand a whole lot more attention of the Prichards. The press and the public were loving it. But inside the house, when those lights went out, it was far from entertainment, and Fred, it would seem, was getting stronger, and it wouldn't be long before he began to manifest his true appearance. And that is where we're going to leave it today. We're going to leave it on a little bit of a cliffhanger, so be sure to join me for part 2 of The Black Monk of Pontefract on the next episode of Bizarre Podcast. Until then, I'll see you soon. Don't have nightmares. Take care. See you soon.